if I had one complaint about my uncle Jacques, it would be this. Il était si doué pour les langues et si fort en anglais que moi, paresseuse comme je ne sais quoi, je n'ai jamais appris à parler français comme il faut. Alors malheureusement, il faut que je continue en anglais. Je m'excuse. Jacques arrived in Bristol in 1949 to study for a PhD with my father, Neville Mott. And we've already been told that they had met through Charles Croussard in the Paris School of Mines. Jacques had had his education and choice of career interrupted and delayed by the war, and that was true of Bristol too. It was an important port, and it had been very heavily bombed. And when Jacques came, it was just recovering, despite large areas of ruins remaining in the city centre. But it had some special resources to draw on. It had an intense civic pride based on its long history. It had a famous theatre and excellent art galleries, museums, and facilities for music. All of these were duly appreciated by Jacques, and he describes his delight in sampling their offerings in his book, Grain de Mondevin. Bristol also had a belief that its university, founded in the early 20th century, could aspire to be the best in the land after the ancient foundations of Oxford and Cambridge. The physics department, led by Professor Arthur Tyndall and then by my father, firmly believed this too, and all of them were working hard to make the dream become reality. One commodity that brought wealth to Bristol was tobacco, and the health warnings on that had not yet been sounded. And tobacco fortunes had a direct bearing on what Jacques found in Bristol, because the physics laboratory had been financed by a tobacco family, and they also endowed my father's professorship. The physics lab that they built was a very special building in rather a special place. It was built like a great big castle, a chateau with turrets everywhere. It was in a place called Royal Fort, where once Prince Rupert, the nephew of Charles I, had had his headquarters at the time of the English Civil War. From these turrets of the physics laboratory, Professor Cecil Powell, who was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1950 for his work on pi mesons, launched his balloons to gather evidence from the stratosphere. Whenever one of these balloons came down, there would be great excitement, with newspaper reporters ringing us up, even in the middle of the night. Better still, we children got the silk cut-offs from the balloons for our dressing up. I think we all felt we were part of the lab community, and indeed, my father made up stories about elephants in the lab to amuse us, because this enormous building looked suitable for elephants. Royal Fort is on a hilltop, and two fine 18th century buildings survived the war. In one of them, right opposite the lab, my parents lived. Hence, there were makings of a close community for the physicists at Bristol, and in it, Jacques flourished, making many friends. One of these was Charles Frank. Jacques wrote that initially my father tried to shift him to work directly under Charles, who was, as he put it, then doing wonders on dislocations. But he, Jacques, felt he had come to learn about electrons in metals, so he insisted on staying with Neville. Neville also tried to interest Jacques in the future of the physics of biology, but Jacques was not to be swayed. Funnily enough, some 40 years later, Neville tried the same tactic on his grandson with much more success, and this rather amused Jacques. The grandson, our son Edmund, is now Professor of Computational Biology at Melbourne University, thanks to his grandfather. Jacques has written about my father's methods. Mott's strength was to concentrate his mind on some recurring questions which he attacked again and again on various sides. He also described him as a theoretician with original ideas expressed in simple mathematics, who loved to talk to experimentalists and most of whose research had practical importance. This approach obviously resonated with Jacques, because in his book he meditates on the British empirical approach and suggests that there is still something to be learned from it by other cultures with different traditions. He wrote, "C'est, je pense, la grande force des anglo-saxons, particulièrement des britanniques, de savoir choisir les facteurs importants dans l'étude d'un phénomène donné, mais aussi de garder en mémoire les limites du modèle simplifié qu'ils construisent." Well, what a compliment. I hope we live up to it. Perhaps my father did, but I think he thought that time and chance had more to do with his own achievements than the merits of British empiricism. I say this because in an interview he gave in 1985 for BBC television, he said he thought that a lucky accident had brought him to solid-state physics at a time in its development when his particular way of working could throw up useful results. He also spoke of physics as a social activity and of the joy of interacting with other physicists. So I wonder whether my father might have thought that Jacques' generalization about Anglo-Saxon thought was not quite empirical enough. At the time, Jacques seems to have found my father's thought processes rather alarming, because he wrote, "My father made this sort of attack on a physics problem like a dog with an old bone, even while driving the two of them, in his inimitable, if somewhat haphazard way, to a meeting in Oxford. Thank goodness there were fewer cars on the road then." I first met Jacques when I was about 6 or 7 years old, because my parents had a wonderful Irish housekeeper and family friend who made it her business to provide a constant supply of cups of tea and sustaining buns to the succession of students who flowed through our house when taking a break from their work. Jacques was of their number. How this lady did it, I don't know, as all foodstuffs were still rationed in those days in England. Maybe special arrangements were in place for this unofficial canteen, where the lab and our house seemed to merge. Jacques then took a room in the house which my Aunt Mary, my mother's younger sister, shared with a friend, and where they let out their spare rooms to students. This was conveniently near the Royal Fort, and I remember that the household sole bath was in the kitchen, which seemed to add to a general air of jollity which pervaded the whole ménage. My aunt, who had trained as a sculptor, was at this time making wonderfully innovative wooden toys, which she sold through Heels, a smart London store. And in this work she was helped by her housemate and by another great friend, Maïta Frank, the wife of Charles. Maïta was an effervescent, beautiful, red-headed lady with an irrepressible sense of humour. She certainly took her husband's work very seriously, but she also thought that all this talk of creep and crawl in metals was hilarious. And even a child like me could see the joke. So, I hope you can see from all this that Jacques found himself in an optimistic city with a physics department pushing forward and a supportive domestic community regularly fortified by strong British tea. Jacques duly gained his Bristol PhD, and later, in 1975, Bristol honoured him as one of its most illustrious former students with an honorary doctorate, which gave my father great pleasure. Perhaps I'm viewing that early time with the rosiness of hindsight, but my parents were very happy in Bristol and always looked back on their time there with particular fondness. So is it any wonder that Jacques, who also enjoyed his time in Bristol, as he makes plain in his writings, decided to take a little bit of that Bristol home with him? He proposed to my aunt on the eve of his departure, married her, and took her off to Paris with him when he left to start their long and very congenial partnership. In his book, Jacques describes getting to know Mary's family and background, but I have to say I don't think we all fully reciprocated. Indeed, it's only in the last couple of decades, since Jacques wrote his memoir and since my cousin Jean shared some of his genealogical researches, that I have learnt how very, very distinguished Jacques' ancestry was, and also that he was, rightly, deeply interested in his own family history. My recollection is that he used to let us all chatter on about our own forebears, which we were inclined to do, and he showed no trace of boredom or impatience. I have to hope that our insular preoccupations with a past exclusively English gave him an opportunity to escape what one might call the hand of scientific destiny, which must have lain on his shoulders as a scion of the Friedel family, and gave him an opportunity to discover who he, Jacques, was as a unique individual. I hope it, but I do not know. Jacques and Mary's departure from Bristol was followed 2 years later by our own removal to Cambridge, when my father became Cavendish Professor of Physics. The changed pattern of our lives led to annual summer visits from the Friedels, as the little boys were brought over for some fresh air and a big garden to play in, while Jacques and my father conferred. My memory of those summers is of my mother making jam, while Mary sterilized endless baby feeding bottles. Meanwhile, Neville and Jacques would be pacing up and down the large lawn, heads bent, hands behind their backs, discussing solid-state physics. I know that Jacques still managed to be what is now called a hands-on father, but what he records of those summers is meetings with Peter Hirsch, John Zyman, Brian Pippard, and with visitors to the Cambridge lab such as Fausto Fumi and Harvey Brooks. I can only add that most of their wives and children passed through our house and garden too. The Cottrell and Perutz families lived in the same road, and the Diracs just round the corner. For more than 60 years, Mary and Jacques lived in the same Paris apartment, which they transformed from a small, dark, and rather cramped place to a delightful treasure house full of the products of their ongoing creativity. Science books and papers increasingly filled in the corners, while the lovely things Mary made were everywhere on display. My first visit was in 1956, and I remember a dour Paris, a bit run down, but still a city with marvelous shops and irresistible food. Oh, the wonder of French ice cream. I vividly remember being taken to Place des Vosges and the Hôtel de Sully before they were smartened up for tourists, and they seemed like marvelous personal discoveries of my aunt and uncles. Later on, they took us around Champagne and northern Burgundy, introducing us to the magnificent cathedrals and abbeys of the area. Should there be any ennui brought on by overexposure to the beauties of French ecclesiastical art, it was quickly banished by stops at delightful restaurants. Always Jacques was welcoming, kind, and utterly reliable. Hence, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to ask him to make a speech at my wedding and later to read at my father's memorial service. When my son did an Erasmus year in Paris as part of his degree course, it was the Friedels who ensured that he had access to home comforts and family support whenever he needed them. Jacques also took a great interest in the institution that my husband worked for, the Open University, and would repeatedly ask in his letters for more particulars about its innovative teaching methods. He also wanted to learn of English schemes for teaching mathematics and physics to students whose schools had failed to give them adequate preparation for taking science degree courses. On his retirement, Jacques spent several months in Cambridge, which was a great bonus for my parents. And there was great joy when in 1995, Cambridge University awarded Jacques an honorary degree. Alas, my parents were no longer around to congratulate Jacques on his elevation to the high point of the Légion d'honneur, but very many of us in the succeeding generations rejoiced with the Friedels. In Jacques' last years, when we used to call on him in Paris, or when he came over to England to visit, many of us felt we got to know him better than ever before. We discovered the enormously wide range of his interests and learning. We discovered he had once considered devoting his life to history and archaeology, and that he had kept in touch with developments in those fields. We discovered his many contacts with and affection for his extended French family, and we discovered that he had by no means retired and was indeed having a late flowering of his career after the sad death of my aunt. Our long conversations I shall always remember. They revealed his questing, agile mind quite undimmed by age. His arguments, and we did have some arguments, were presented with clarity, great good humour, and always with respect for the views of the other person. All his English relations loved and revered him, and we certainly miss him and feel his loss. I am very greatly honoured to have been given this opportunity to come and tell you so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in addition, you are just on time. Perfect. One short question. Very short question.
It's not a question. We would have loved to have Walter Cohn here. Several among in the audience have been postdocs with Walter Cohn in California and even before in Pittsburgh, but I don't think Daniel is around. Or, you know. So, well, Walter was unable to come because his health is no longer in a good enough shape to be able to make a long trip. But we all know that he has very strong relation, at a personal level with Jacques Friedel, as well as on the scientific level. They consider themselves as a Fourier transform of each other. So I know that you know what Friedel oscillations are. So instead of that, Walter has accepted to send us a very nice letter. And I think such a letter deserves a very good Cambridge accent to be read. So Alice has agreed to read this letter from Walter Cohn to the audience today.
Jacques Friedel was one of my closest friends. He was someone I admired tremendously and enjoyed years and years of friendship with, and my family with his family. Their hospitality was always the most cordial. We enjoyed watching his boys grow up and become the outstanding people they are today. His friendship was one of the best parts of my life, and going over my memories of him brings me great pleasure. We first met at a Gordon conference in 1953, where we were both presenters. I remember the conference very well, primarily because of Jacques' presence there. There was no language barrier, as he had an excellent command of English, much better than I am in French. Despite the geographic distance between us, we managed to meet often, as I spent as much time as possible in Paris and often travelled to his laboratory at the University of Paris in Orsay. Much of this time was spent in lively discussions, and we acted as sounding boards for each other. He had the gift of distilling experimental facts into original and truthful questions, and an interest in the practical applications of scientific insights. Our scientific thinking had a great deal of overlap, not only in our fields of interest, but also in the way we thought about things. His scientific persona profoundly influenced me. As a scientist, he was inspiring, influential, and historic figure. This is not only my opinion, but can be confirmed by the awards and honours he received, the last being the Grand Cross of the French Légion d'honneur in 2013, and his positions as president of the French Physical Society, European Physical Society, and the French Academy of Sciences. His legacy will be his lasting impact on French science and the many successful students he mentored. I am very happy to participate in this memorial celebration of Jacques, even from here in Santa Barbara. There are some gifts that come with old age, and one of them is good friends who have been companions through life. Jacques was one of those, and he will always remain in my thoughts.